Welcome to the Online Great Books podcast, brought to you by OnlineGreatBooks.com, where we talk about the good life, the great books, great conversation, and great ideas. I'm Scott Hambrick.
I'm Karl.
And today, on the Online Great Books podcast, we're going to discuss a short story from Wendell Berry. It's in his book, That Distant Land. We're going to read and discuss Pray Without Ceasing. One of our listeners DM'd me on Instagram and said, you should read this. And since I didn't have any better ideas, I said, nah, that'll be fine. That'll be good.
We've read 90% of the books that exist.
Is that big claim?
We've read a whole bunch of books. We've read all the surface stuff that, hey, what do you want to read? Let's read this. And now we're kind of digging. What are we going to read?
There's a lot more we want to read, but we're scared of it. It's too big, or somebody might get the vapors if we read it,
Yeah.
People don't talk about the vapors enough anymore, Karl.
The vapors?
Yeah, they don't talk about that.
I don't know anyone who's gotten the vapors. I do after a heavy press sometimes.
Yeah, the vapors we need to bring that back.
People used to faint a lot more than they do now. Makes me suspect that in the old days it was theatrical.
Well, that's interesting that you should say that. People are not above being theatrical for sure. Right. But I think there were probably more deeply ingrained norms and expectations, and that transgressions were probably rarer.
Huh.
I could imagine that there were more things that people found shocking than there are now.
That might be the case.
There was no Pornhub in 1847.
No, good Lord. My daughter, who has an interest, I don't know how she got this interest, but kids are weird, in historical clothing, would tell you, well, they were wearing corsets, and so didn't have as much air.
Their pulse ox was already low, and then somebody dropped the F-bomb, and she just hit the deck. Could be. My kids and my wife follow this young man. People will know who this is. Somebody that's listening is going to know who this is, and I don't, so this is terrible pod. But they follow this young man who's in England, and he's got to be under 21 or 22 years old, and he's into this historical clothing, and he's into tailoring and making his own clothes, and he makes these beautiful Regency era clothes. So he dresses like Mr. Darcy, in the BBC Pride and Prejudice, and he just makes these amazing clothes. They follow this guy on Instagram, and it's really interesting.
I think that's a good idea. So all you Zoomers out there who think you're being transgressive, you can't transgress anymore. There's nothing you can do that's edgy anymore.
Back
tattoos,
to the future.
Piercings, there's nothing you can do. Anything that you can do, somebody's done it. Here's something that you can do. Bring back an ancient clothing style. Just walk around in a top hat and tails with a walking cane. I don't know. Pick your era, but
Raccoon
do that.
Coats,
just
like the 20s.
Oh, sure. Straw hats, maybe.
Yeah.
You and your buddies in like Jeeves and Wooster.
Spats. Yeah.
I would support that movement. I think that would be fantastic, rather than whatever people wear now, which is in this era of Zoom, nothing. I mean, sweatpants.
I'm not, fashion just hasn't changed in years and years. I mean, it's, whatever athletic shoe is popular, jeans and a shirt. It's been like that since 93.
A t-shirt.
Right, t-shirt. It's been like that since 93. You can't tell 2004 fashion from 2020 at this point. Yeah, it's upsetting.
Yeah, well, none of my nicer clothing actually fits anymore, so that's a problem. But it's hard to get tailored, fashion-conscious clothing if you're 5'11", 252. You just end up looking like Kingpin.
Well, most of the people that I've got to defend you. Most of the people that listen to this, you just said 5'11" and 252, and they think that you're broad as you are tall, but you got a 600-pound squat, so... what's your waist right now, Karl?
38-ish.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, and that's not your pant size. That's like the tape around your navel, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Handsome, fit man, Karl.
Why, thank you. But I'm under 6 feet and therefore not fit for rule.
Yes, true.
Anyway, so we're a bit distracted, but that's what podcasting is about, I think.
For us, it is.
For us, it is. Oh, wait, before we get started, dear listener, so did you see the thing I posted in our Pod Talk channel? The guy that did the satire of what podcasts are like?
Yeah.
Should we do a minute of that?
I can't even do it.
I'm really glad you brought that up. I'm happy that we're having that conversation right now. I think it's a really important conversation to have.
Ugh.
You know, if we could step out and get a big picture view and not get into the weeds about this conversation. All right, that's as much as I can do.
Just don't ever say anything.
Well, anyway, so we're going to talk Pray Without Ceasing. This is a story of a terrible thing that happened in the past where Thad Coulter shoots Ben Feltner. Shoots him dead.
Yeah, so this is another Wendell Berry story. I think this is the first author that we've done 2 shows on. Well, wait a minute. That we've done 2 different pieces about.
Yeah.
I think. So this is Wendell Berry, and famously, most of his fiction is about what he calls the Port William membership. It's the people of the little town of Port William. And this book, That Distant Land, is a compilation of short stories about the Port William membership. And they seem to be, I didn't read the whole book yet, they seem to be in chronological order. And the first story is called The Hurt Man, and it has a date on here, 1888. And this is, I don't know, 4th or 5th story in the book. And it's Pray Without Ceasing, 1912. So, if you're from Port William, and I am, this is part of our history.
This is Tolkien-esque in its detail. He's got whole families' histories worked out. It's just, instead of Fantasyland, it's Eastern Kentucky?
Yeah.
And so you'll see things alluded to, for example, in Jayber Crow that you can read the story of in That Distant Land. And he's written a bunch of these novels. I'll probably read them all eventually.
Yeah, we talked about in Jayber Crow, his friend Burley Coulter, he's a Coulter, takes Jayber to see the banker, Mr. Feltner, who was selling the old barber shop. And that banker, that Jayber, he took his shoe off in front of him and pulled his life savings out of the lining of his coat and out of the toe of his shoe and put the down payment on that in the parlor there at the banker's house. That banker was Matt Feltner. And this story is about the death of Matt Feltner's father at Burley Coulter's, I think his uncle's hand.
Yeah.
Heavy duty.
Yeah, could be a feud there. Yeah, there's a lot I want to talk about, and I got to save some of it. So the title, Pray Without Ceasing, you Zoomers might not know, that's a Bible quote. 1 Thessalonians 5:16-18. Well, it's actually at 17. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. Pray without ceasing. So this is a story of bad things happening. The title for me is that there are characters in this that nevertheless rejoice always, pray without ceasing, and give thanks in all circumstances, even though it's a very terrible circumstance that happens. In fact, you could probably say that Thad goes wrong because he can't do this.
So interesting.
Yeah.
Do you like this story?
Yes and no. Yes, it's well done. There's important messages in there, which doesn't necessarily make it a good story. It hits hard. I was thinking about it because I don't want to tell the details, but there has been in my ancestry a similar incident, probably a worse incident than this. Right. And they did not rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks. So after the poor lady was killed, my relative, and killed and worse, the priest was telling the people, no, don't do anything. We want to be peaceful. They didn't. They went out and they found the guy they thought done it and tore him to pieces. So this is a potential lynching that didn't happen in this story. It hits a little home because about 100 years ago, it happened. Mm-hmm. And was very bad.
Uncle Roy was telling me stories the other day. About 140 years ago, my maternal grandmother, her maiden name was Smithy, and there were Smithies in Georgia. The story I was told, a man in town had done something very bad, and that the other men in town determined that regardless of what the courts said, he needed to go. And I won't give all the names, even though they've been dead for 100 years. Everybody said, "Hey, Smithy, you don't have any kids, and you're not married. You need to do it."
Goodness.
So he took care of that guy and left the country, which at that time means you end up in Indian Territory. And came to Indian Territory. By and by, his brothers all ended up at Rogers County, Craig County, Oklahoma, or Indian Territory at that time, and here I sit. This is not necessarily fiction.
No, it's so in the second paragraph, but the past is present also. And this, I think, is a part of the greater mystery we call eternity. Although Matt Feltner has been dead for 25 years and I'm now older than he was when I was born and have grandchildren of my own, I know his hands, their way of holding a hammer or a hoe or a set of check lines. It goes on. The past is not gone. The past is not gone. It's there. I remember my grandmother, whose aunt it was the lady that had the young lady that had terrible things done to her and for whom a guy was lynched. She always had a shrine in her backyard. We never, really knew why. She never talked about it, not to me at least. She had bad things. Her dad died when she was young. She was an orphan, and her aunt had died, and there had been violence in her hometown, and it makes her the person that she was. It makes you the person that you are, except there's two ways you can go, and I think this story is about it, and we'll go in more detail. So Matt Feltner has a choice. So if you haven't read it, we already spoiled it for you, okay?
It's only 38 pages.
Yeah, so Matt Feltner comes out of, I guess, the blacksmith, wherever he was, when they hear the gunshot, and he finds out that it's his father that's been killed. And he says, "Who did this?" And they tell him, "Thad Coulter done it." Well, he's going to go kill him. He's got a choice right there to return evil for evil. And I guess it's his uncle?
His uncle, yeah.
I was looking for a family tree, and I couldn't find one drawn up. I was trying to figure out who all these people were.
They're out there.
But Jack grabs him, just steps out of the store and sees him running and doesn't even have time to think. And he sees the murderous intent on Matt's face, and as he's going after Thad Coulter, he just grabs him and holds on to him. A 65-year-old guy holding on to a young fella.
20-year-old, 18, 17, 20, something like that.
Yeah, and holds him until he comes back to his senses. He had a chance to go after him and kill the murderer, but he didn't. And they even afterwards, they come and they ask him, we've got a mob people. We've got a bunch of people here. We can go do justice. You just give the word. And Matt Feltner says, "Nope. Thank you. No. Come on in. I've got food prepared." Things happen. Evil happens. And that's why I go back to this quote. Even as the evil happens, can you rejoice always, pray without ceasing? If you're the sort that prayers, give thanks in all circumstances. Can you do that? Even as your dad's dead in the street. It makes a difference. What if he'd gone after him? If you're a member of the Port William Society, the Port William membership, and you've read some of these books, what would have happened to everybody else in these stories if Matt Feltner had gone out and killed Thad Coulter?
Burley wouldn't have taken Jaber to Matt's house.
Right. Yeah. Maybe there'd been a feud. It's been known to happen where you go down generations, you don't even remember why you're fighting. I don't know what I would have done.
Yeah, I don't know either. Anybody that says is lying. They may not know they're lying, but they don't know. I just love the way he writes. I just love Berry's writing. So the guy writing this story or telling the story is Andy Catlett. And if you read some more of these Berry stories, you'll know he's sort of Andy collects these stories and is trying to preserve the memory of Port William. So a lot of the stories that come after Jaber Crow, Andy's collected them up. And he says, of his grandfather, who was Matt, he said, when I sat down beside him, his hand would clap lightly onto my leg above my knee. My absence might have lasted many months, but he would say, as though he had been together the day before, "Hello, Andy. The shape of his hand is printed on the flesh of my thigh as vividly as a birthmark. This man, who is my grandfather, is present in me as I have felt always his father to be present in him. His father was Ben. He writes the way I recollect things.
Mm-hmm.
It's a familiar groove for me, these Wendell Berry stories.
Yeah.
You know.
I like, even at the end of that paragraph, the live knowledge of the Feltners in Port William begins with Ben, whom I know from my grandfather's stories. That's the known history. The names go back to Ben's father and grandfather. So the way you think about history, I know some of the history up through my great-grandparents. Never met them.
Right. We
have names, but the line stops there. The line of memory that's transmitted to me of things that they did. I don't know that much about my great-grandparents on my dad's side. I know great-grandma made cookies, and my dad loved them. We'd go out to the farm, and she always had cookies. But I don't know who their parents were. I don't know anything. That's the end. So there's a line that stops, you know. And if I go up north and visit my wife's people, there's all sorts of people with her last name in the cemetery by the church. There's this wonderful church in the middle of Wisconsin, this Polish Catholic church. And they're filling the cemetery, but I say, who are these people? And they don't know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They don't know. There's just names. So there's a limit. You're talking about memory, that the memory of people, and then there's a limit, and all you have are names. That's the way I think of it too. I had a student once say to me, it was a moment of self-realization, and he said to me, gosh, filial piety is really important to you. And I said, yeah, I think it is. I think it is. And I think it's a virtue that used to be everywhere, mm-hmm. that we've lost a bit. So in this story, it's clearly in this story, it's all through the Wendell Berry stuff. It's all about the history, the people that went before you, not judgmentally. You're not going to judge them and say how stupid and terrible they were. Maybe they were, but nevertheless, they're the reason you're here. In Virgil, that wonderful poem that we'll read in like year 18 of our program, the Aeneid. It's pious Aeneas. And what they mean by that is, well, he gives the gods their due, but he also gives his parents, his father, his due.
He literally bears him on his back.
Yeah, carries him on his shoulder,
yeah,
out of the burning city. This used to be a bigger deal than it is now. Whereas now I think we tend to say, you know, okay, boomer.
Well, that's okay, because they suck so bad.
Not if your dad's one.
Well,
no, it's improper to say about your dad.
Yeah, it's true. What if he's being a boomer?
Well, if it's in humor, I guess you could say it. Yeah. But, you know, if it weren't for him, you wouldn't be there. So whatever his shortcomings, they're you.
Right.
But people think they're these isolated monads that popped into existence out of nowhere, have no history, have no roots. But you do. You are the way you are because of the people that came before you. Mm-hmm. And if you understand the people that came before you, you might understand yourself a little bit better. Be a little more forgiving. I don't know. That's probably just pie in the sky talk, though.
I don't know. I don't think so, Karl.
Is this story too much for you?
All of it is. I, like you, have been oppressed by memory.
Yes.
For these many years or months. Just that first page where he mentions his granddad's hands twice. And I remember my granddad's hands more than most other things. I remember them more than his face. I could certainly pick him out of a crowd, you know. I mean, of course. But I don't know. I just don't see enough importance put on the kinds of details that are in these Berry stories in popular culture. And it makes me sad because to me, they're very important. And I project. I assume that if they're important to me, that if other people had them, they would also be important to them. And a lot of people don't have this. You know, we did this show. We've done the show on Wendell Berry. We did a show on distributism. You and I are, at this point, famously homebodies. And I get people that email and they're like, yeah, but, you know, what if your hometown sucks and you need to move to Kansas City or whatever? My hometown sucks, and I'm sitting right in the middle of it right now. The cult of the new and the idea of progress just bugs the hell out of me. This is the opposite of that.
Maybe you move from your home country, from your hometown. It probably ought to be more momentous than it is. I always think of that Solzhenitsyn line from Gulag Archipelago. Mother Russia, yes, but what if your mother's a whore? And that's not me talking, that's him.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe things become so bad in your home that you have to leave, but you probably ought to be sad about it.
Well, yeah. So I had a guy message me, and he said, "Well, if it wasn't for people that left home, what would America be? A lot of those people that left were going to get killed. Cromwell was having the mega freak out, and England wasn't a very safe place for a large number of people. We've got this mythology about the Pilgrims, and they wore big buckles on their shoes and funny hats, and we make hand turkeys around Thanksgiving. Those people fled and did that because staying was worse. There were a number of people who were adventurers for sure, but a large number of people left because there was no safe alternative to leaving. That's not discussed enough. And just because your Fortune 500 employer asks you to transfer to Atlanta, you're no pilgrim. It's not the same thing.
And even if you go to Atlanta, there's a cost because where are your parents?
Right.
I guess you could Zoom with them, but we're losing something. We're losing a lot.
One of my dad's jobs now is teaching all the grandkids how to drive. Which is a pretty good job for me to not have.
Does he want to teach my kids?
Yeah, he will. He's better at it now than when he taught me. I'll tell you that. None of my kids came home with pump knots on their head like I did. But one of the things he always does is makes them drive to all these cemeteries all over Northeast Oklahoma.
Excellent.
And then it's like, here's where all the Coxes are buried, and here's where all the Smithies are buried, and here's where all the Hamburgs are buried, and all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, we went out to Lena, Illinois. You can look it up on the map. It's not even in Lena. It's in the outskirts of Lena, where there's some chutes buried on the hilltop.
In the greater Lena metropolitan area.
Illinois is not like Chicago.
No.
And that's really not like Chicago out there. I'm on page 48. I've got a digital copy. I'm sorry. Couldn't get it fast enough. It is always the first morning of creation and always the last day, always the now that is in time and the now that is not, that has filled time with reminders of itself. I'm not sure what that means, but I sure like it. It's always the first morning of creation and always the last day. Well, it's always the first morning because everything that happened in the past has culminated in you. It's all there. Heck, you could be 100% secular on this. Neil Stephenson has a similar thought in the beginning of one of his novels. I can't remember which one, about how from that very first replicating organic molecule in the ocean up until you, if that chain's broken at any moment, you're not there. And so all of those creatures that are in your ancestry, presuming that story's correct, they were badasses. That's what Neil Stephenson says. They survived all the plagues and all the wars and managed to procreate before they got the axe.
Yep.
And if any of them had missed, there's no you. You are at the end of a very, very long line of very cool people, just by the fact that you exist. I think that's kind of neat. That means even the the people that I might see when I'm out and I don't like very much, well, they made it too. Their ancestors were tough people, or they wouldn't be there. I don't know. That, I guess filial piety is a big deal to me, as my student said. Well, anyway, should we get to this story?
Yeah. That's what we've been talking about.
Poor Thad. What Thad has done. So the story kicks off. Bramer, I'm going to trip on the names. I've only read 1.5 Wendell Berry books. This gentleman, Bramer Hardy comes. There's a good name. Bramer Hardy comes to the door, spends a little time making fun of Andy, saying that he doesn't get up early enough. I thought that was funny. Clearly implying, and still in excellent humor, that the family line had reached its nadir in me. See, you can do that with your friends.
It's true.
But then he's got this old newspaper clipping. So I found this in a drawer, and I thought you ought to have it. And so it's the story of the headline, Ben Feltner, friend to all, shot dead in Port William.
That's a pretty good headline. Karl Shute, friend to all.
What happened to me?
Lynched. No,
Oh, no, gosh. But
that's a pretty good headline.
there's another thing that hits me hard. So nobody in the family told me the story of, it's my great-grandfather's sister. Is that great-aunt or great-great-aunt?
Great-aunt. Great-great-aunt.
Great-grand... No, my grandfather's sister would be my great-aunt.
Yeah, great-great-aunt.
Two greats. So I was just digging into, because Ancestry.com was free because of the Corona plague.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was digging around on it, and I found the newspaper story. Nobody in my family had told me this. And then I asked him about it, but it's like similar to this story. So Ben Feltner was shot dead by Thad Coulter. So there's your bad guy, right? Thad is the bad guy?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. Thad Coulter was a good kind of feller, too, far as that goes. I don't reckon he was the kind you'd have thought would shoot somebody either. I like the joke that Bramer makes. He says, I lent $500 to a gentleman once, and then I found out a week later he killed himself. I wished he'd have done it sooner.
Right.
Oh, I thought that was funny.
Yep.
Yeah, you have, I guess the good guy is Ben and the bad guy is Thad. That might be the story in like a half-hour TV show or a 45-minute TV show. And you have the wicked, nefarious Thad Coulter just like twirling his black mustache and deciding to go and kill the one that's loved by all. But that's not the way it is. So what makes Thad do it? Why'd he do it? What happened to him?
He borrowed money.
Yep.
Yeah, so Andy, this article shows up, this newspaper clipping shows up because Bramer's wife likes to antique. He says, the madam you know is hell for an antique. And he gives it to Andy, and it's about one of his ancestors, and Andy decides, well, he's going to go to his grandparents' house. And he loads up in the truck and goes to Port William and turned in under the old maples beside the house. And when I let myself in, the house was quiet. When I let myself in, you know what that means? It means they don't lock the door.
Yeah.
Ruby never locks the door. Nobody even knocks. They all just walk in over there. Charity's grandma's. And he went in, and grandfather is not doing well. He's ill. And he's in there talking to grandpa. And grandmother yells, "Oh, Andy!" He goes in there, and she tells the story.
Yeah, and the grandmother is Margaret. I'm trying to keep track of who these people are because she shows up in the story. So she was there in town. Is she a Beecham?
I think so. I think that's right. Yeah.
So maybe Jack was the father-in-law. That's where I get confused. I have enough trouble with my own family tree.
Well, they're all related. The Coulters and the Feltners and the Catlets and the Beechams have all intermarried, and it's a mess, which is how it goes.
Yeah.
Aunt Bonnie was a Simpkins. You know how they
are. You might if y'all lived in the same town.
We do.
We get this story, and I've read this twice, and so I'm highlighting that. I think this is on page 52. She starts telling this story, and she sets it up. It's a wonder, she said, that Matt didn't kill Thad Coulter that morning. So if you're looking for the deed, I guess there's two big deeds that happened. And the one is that Thad Coulter shot Ben Feltner in the head with a .22. That's a momentous deed. The other great deed, the other heroic deed, is Matt not chasing him down and killing him. So there's a deed of commission and a deed of omission that I suppose determines the character of each of those characters. This is a hard story.
Yeah. So he goes into his grandma and she says, "What is it? Tell Granny." And then he has to. And there's a paragraph there about why he has to. And then she told me the story. She told it quietly, looking through the window into that July morning in 1912. Her hands lay in her lap and never moved. The only effect her telling had on her was a glistening that appeared from time to time in her eyes. She told the story well, giving many details. She had a good memory, and she had lived many years with her mother-in-law, who also had a good one. I have the impression that they, but not my grandfather, had pondered together over the event many times. She spoke as if she were seeing it all happen, even the parts of it that she had, in fact, not seen. So, her mother-in-law, that she had lived with a good many years, is Ben Felter's wife, the widow of the murder. Her husband is Matt.
Mm-hmm.
The grandfather, he says, I have the impression that they, but not my grandfather, had pondered together over the event many times. His grandfather is the one that ultimately doesn't kick Thad Coulter's ass.
Mm-hmm.
And he has the impression that he had not talked about it very much with them. If it hadn't been for Jack Beecham, Matt would have killed him, my grandmother said. Blah, blah, blah. And here, Thad's character enters the story. Thad not only secured his son's note with the farm that was all he had in the world, that he had only recently finished paying for, but he further committed himself by bragging in Port William of his son's new status as a merchant in the town, or the county seat.
Yeah, so Abner Coulter, does he show up in any of the other stories?
I don't know enough of these to know. Probably.
See, what I would want is for him to be treated as a bad guy and get bad things to happen to him, but Wendell Berry probably won't do that. He'll write a novel someday, Abner Coulter, and it'll be the whole story of Abner and the thing that he did that got his father dead. Okay, so what Abner did was he didn't like working on the farm, or it's probably might be his parents' fault too, because they thought Abner was smart, and being smart, that means he's too good for the farm. And that means he's got to go somewhere. He can't stay there. And so they take out a mortgage on the farm so that...
to set him up in business.
So that Abner can set up a store.
Right.
Well, Abner's not real good. He doesn't have as much character as they'd hoped he'd had. And, he went out of business and got on a horse and left town.
Thad Coulter was not a bad man, my grandmother said. I believe then and I believe now that he was not a bad man, but we are all as little children. Some know it and some don't. She looked at me to see if I was one who knew it, and I nodded, but I was 30 then and did not know it yet. He was a little child, she said, and he was in serious trouble.
So before 2 years were out, Abner repaid his father's confidence by converting many small private fritterings and derelictions into an undisguisable public failure, and thereupon by riding off to somewhere unknown on the back of a bay gelding borrowed ostensibly for an overnight trip to Port William. And so Thad's fate was passed from the reckless care of his son to the small mercy of the law. Without more help than he could confidently expect, he was going to lose his farm. Even with help, he was going to have to pay for it again, and he was close to 60 years old.
So, here's your MBA right here. Abner repaid his father's confidence by converting many small private fritterings and derelictions into an undisguisable public failure. That's how you go out of business.
Mm-hmm.
Small private fritterings and derelictions.
Yeah, so he's in a bad way. He doesn't see any way out. It's just heartbreaking. He says on, I think, page 53, Thad's having a hard time. He's drinking a lot. I worked for it, and I come to own it, he said over and over again. Now them will own it that never worked for it. And him that stood on it to mount up into the world, done run to perdition without a patch, damn him to cover his ass or a rag to hide his face. This is like King Lear.
Right.
Betrayed by his child. Well, what's he going to do? He's got to get help. He's probably the sort of person that never wanted to ask for help.
Of course.
And he goes to his friend, and his friend is Ben Feltner. But he's been drinking for 2 days when he goes to see Ben. Then it doesn't go well.
No. Ben was astonished by the look of him. Thad had always been a man who used himself hard, and he had grown gaunt and stooped, his mouth slowly caving in as he lost teeth. But that morning he was also soiled, sagging, unshaved, and uncombed, his eyes bloodshot and glary. But Ben said, "Come in, Thad. Come in and sit down." And he took him by the arm, led him to the chair, and sat down facing him. "They got me, Ben," Thad said. The poor man don't stand no show. So Thad's drunk, and he's a mess, and he's ranting. It says Thad's language in his ranting in the place would not have been excusable had he been sober. He's probably cussing. Berry won't even write that down. I sure do want to know Wendell Berry. Ben finally has enough. He says,
I hear he doesn't use computers, though.
I know.
So, not likely to happen.
Finally, Ben stopped him. "Thad, I tell you what, I don't believe I can talk with you anymore this morning. Go home now and get sober and come back, and then we'll see." Thad did not have to take Ben's words as an insult, but in his circumstances and condition, it was perhaps inevitable that he would. I got a couple of those stories, Karl.
Yeah?
Used to be this church I went to. There was another couple that had young children that was in the kind of clique that I ran around in at this church. And we went to a party at another family's house, and all the children were there, and everybody was carrying on and having a good time and eating. And it was in the spring, and the weather was good, so the doors and windows were open, and there was no difference between inside and outside the house, you know. I was leaned up in the doorway, facing out onto the patio or deck or whatever in the back. And there were people talking behind me, and there were people in front of me talking. I was just watching and listening. And I heard something at my feet, and I looked down, and there was an 18-month-old eating dog food. And I heard that rattle of the dog dish or whatever on the concrete, and I looked down and saw that, and I chuckled and started to bend over to pick the child up. The child's mother, Erica, saw me and said, "Oh, you think that's real funny? How long have you been watching that?" And just twisted off on me. I chose to not defend myself. And I turned on my heel and walked away. I said, "I'm sorry about that." I turned on my heel and walked away.
That was a fulcrum point.
Erica apparently had a hard on for me for a long time. And she had negative sentiment about me, apparently. So sometime later, maybe that same year, something like that, all the families that had children, that younger children, went on a trip to this lodge thing. There had been a bonfire and, you know, all kinds of stuff, and the kids are carousing and raising Cain. And I had watched her boy, who was about 2.5 or 3 years old, eat a lot of junk food all day. And it was time to go to bed, and everybody went to their respective rooms, and their room was right next to my family's room. And that kid started screaming at about 9 p.m. like they were gutting him. I mean, screaming bloody murder. And it just went on and on and on. And I thought, boy, he's got a stomachache or something, you know, something's going on in there. And I stepped out in the hall and was just going to walk around because I wasn't no sleeping going on, you know. And I stepped out in the hall, and she stepped in the hall right at that same time. And she looked at me, and I looked at her, and I shrugged, and she said, and I said, you know, I think and I thought to myself, I'd already thought, because I had kids older than her, and I've had kids a little longer. And I thought, boy, if that was my kid, I would put the kid in the car seat, and we would start driving to town. And if the kid didn't go to sleep, I'd go ahead and go to the emergency room, because they typically will fall asleep in the car. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And if by time I drove into Seminole, Oklahoma, which was like 40 more minutes, if that kid hadn't stopped screaming, it probably needed an appendectomy or something, you know? So I thought that's what I would do. She shrugged, and she looked at me. She said, "Ow, ow, ow." And I said, you know, if I was you, I'd put the kid in the car. And she didn't let me finish. And she said, "I bet you'd leave him there too, wouldn't you?" I said, "Erica, y'all have a good night."
Oh.
And I never spoke to her again. And I was around her all the time, and I never spoke to her again. If she came into the room, I stood up and I walked out of the room. She would have shot me in the head with a 22.
She might have.
Yeah.
Though there's still time.
Right. Oh, yeah.
you have a choice when these things happen. You can take them in the worst way or in the best way. It's not always an insult. This wasn't an insult at all. It was an offer to help. It's just go get sober first.
Yeah, he was a mess.
If you're a drinker and you're a mean drunk, you're an angry drunk, you better not.
Yeah.
Just don't. Well, Thad's not very happy with this. He says, I cuss you to your damned face, Ben Feltner, for I have come to you with my hat in my hand, and you have spit in it. The hat or the hand. You have throwed in your lot with them sons of bitches against me. And then Ben says, you have to go.
At that, Ben reached his limit. Yet even then, he did not become angry. He was a large, unfearful man, and his self-defense had something of a merriment in it. He stood up. Now, Thad, my friend, he said, you must go. And he helped him to the door. He did not do so violently or with an excess of force. But though he was 72 years old, Ben was still hardy in strength, and he helped Thad to the door in such a way that Thad had no chance but to go. That's great.
Mm-hmm. But then Thad just stands outside like for an hour, just glowering. This is what could have been done to change this. The thing about stories, and it always seems like it has to happen the way it happened.
Right.
Narrative fallacy.
Yeah, some of the women folk could have come out there and brought him some nice tea and said, sit down and have a sandwich and what's wrong with you, and sent for his wife, something. Who knows?
Well, his wife wasn't well. His daughter had taken over their house.
Right, that's true.
Martha Elizabeth. And so the narrator, who is Margaret, Granny, she's there. They're in the house. They've heard this stuff, or at least they've heard Thad. So this is the part that's an eyewitness account, according to the story. And then Martha Elizabeth comes and takes him home. Martha Elizabeth is Thad's daughter. She seems to be as good as gold. So when Martha Elizabeth came to where Thad was, she stopped the mules, got down. So far as they could see from the house, she did not plead with him. She did not say anything at all. She took hold of him, turned him toward the wagon, led him to it. She held on to him as he climbed unsteadily up into the wagon and sat down in the spring seat, and then, gathering her skirts in one hand, she climbed up and sat beside him. And all the while she was gentle with him. Afterward and always my grandmother remembered how gentle Martha Elizabeth had been with him. Thad's daughter comes and takes him home.
His good kid.
Yeah, well, we don't know about the other three, but they've left.
Yeah.
They're off married or something. So 17-year-old Martha Elizabeth has taken over the household. Is Wendell Berry against drinking?
Sure seems like it. The hog killing, the scene at the grandstand, the Feltner shooting, it's all got booze in it. He seems like a teetotaler. I worried about that.
Does that lure him a notch?
Yeah.
I enjoy alcohol, but not that much.
So I love Dale Watson.
Yes.
And he likes to say, now, I don't drink normally. And he has this whole routine about how he doesn't drink normally.
Mm-hmm.
It's abnormal the way he drinks. Alcohol's a bad thing. I mean, you and I have talked about Plato, or Socrates says somewhere that everyone does everything in pursuit of the good. I can't remember which one of the dialogues it is. Or he asked the question, do people ever do anything in pursuit of the bad, or do they always do things in pursuit of the good? And there's a lot of debate about it. And Karl says, well, even the guy who smokes a cigarette, this is what I think you said, even the guy that smokes a cigarette doesn't do it because he's pursuing cancer. He's doing it because it's soothing, that he's looking for the stimulating effect of the nicotine. He's doing it for what he perceives to be a good in that thing. And alcohol poses a big problem, because there is definitely a lot of bad in it. It's convivial. You can enjoy a drink with your friends.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it sure does taste good, but boy, there's a lot of evil that comes from it too.
Have you become a teetotaler?
Me?
Yes.
No, I am not. But I tell you what, I hate to be drunk, and I hate a drunk. I generally will stop drinking when I start feeling it affecting me at all. I don't even like the buzz.
Mm-hmm.
I like it because it tastes good. And like I said, like the scene at the grandstand in the Jayber Crow story, there's conviviality, fraternity around the use of that. We have almost ritual around drinking that seems to Help relationships when it doesn't hurt them and get you shot in the head with a .22 revolver.
Well, but Thad was not drinking in any sort of a convivial way. He was out in the barn emptying his jug.
Yeah, he was drinking corn liquor straight out of a jug in the barn in a rage.
Yeah, this is not sitting with your friends and having a few beers. I don't like drunkenness myself. Chesterton says somewhere he has like poems in praise of wine. You can drink until you're no longer able to make poetry in praise of it. Mm-hmm. Any more than that's a sin, he says, because you've damaged your rationality.
That's a good test.
Yeah, and I think being in a group, if it's a decent group, it ought to help moderation.
Yeah.
You know, the point of the drinking is not the drunkenness. The point is the fun.
Right.
Well, Thad's not having any fun.
No.
Poor guy. I want to talk about a line that I like. This is on, I think, page 57. Except for the telephone lines, the town, as it looked to Ben Feltner on that July morning 78 years ago, might have been unchanged for many more years than it had existed. It looked older than its history. And yet, in Port William, as everywhere else, it was already the second decade of the 20th century, and in some of the people of the town and the community surrounding it, one of the characteristic diseases of the 20th century was making its way, the suspicion that they would be greatly improved if they were someplace else. This disease had entered into Thad Coulter and into Abner. If only I go someplace else, things will be better. They had thought that for their son, Abner. Abner, he's too good. He's got to leave town. But Thad can't quite leave town. He has a mortgage.
Yeah, it's not just that. He says this disease had entered into Thad Coulter and into Abner. In Thad, it was fast coming to crisis. If Port William could not save him, then surely there was another place that could. But Thad could not just leave as Abner had. Port William had been too much his life for that, and he was held also by his friendship for Ben Feltner, and for himself as a man whom Ben Feltner had befriended, a friendship that Ben Feltner seemed now to have repudiated and made hateful. Port William was a stumbling block to Thad, and he must rid himself of it somehow.
Yeah. So he's got to kill his hometown. And the way he's going to do it is by killing his friend.
Man, I get it. I have spent a great deal of my life hating Catoosa, Oklahoma. Like so many things and so many people, the town is a person, as far as I can tell. Our virtues are also our weaknesses, and the good things about it are also a big problem. The interconnectedness of a small town like that is mighty oppressive sometimes. That sort of parochialism, that sort of is difficult. But it's also a very, very good thing. So if you're Thad, and you're interconnected with these people, they might all know your business and the shame that you have because your son was a failure in the county seat, but they'll also help him get out of it. I understand that. I've hated this little town a lot, but here I sit.
Yeah. Well, I'm 7 miles away from where I grew up. My brothers have both left. I'm the one that's still here. Maybe I'm the fool.
Wherever you go, dear listener, is somebody else's hometown that they hate and that has been oppressed to them and that they had to leave. So if you think you're slick and you left Carthage, Missouri to go to Chicago, there's somebody from Chicago that went to New York. Like wherever you go was somebody else's problem.
If Thad goes somewhere else, if Thad does not shoot his friend, it would have been better. But if he leaves town, he's still going to be himself. He's still going to be the failure that he is. That's not going to change. It's short-term comfort, I suppose, but if you don't have your internal life in order, moving's not going to fix anything.
Right. There's a country song that says, wherever you go, there you are.
Uh-huh.
And that's the problem.
Yeah, that's the problem. So I went to a funeral yesterday, was privileged to be asked to be a pallbearer for a friend of mine, Patrick. So I went to the funeral, and they said nice things about Patrick, and most of them were true that they said. But one thing that was interesting to me, this was his childhood parish, and he was 60. He was going to turn 68 this month. I was talking to a former student of both of ours, and she's pretty broken up by it. But then I went out One of the things they talked about in the funeral was the hijinks that young Patrick had pulled in the grade school.
80 years ago.
Yeah, but then as I was standing outside talking to the widow and to my student, and I look off to the right, and there's the Catholic school kids out on recess. And I thought that Patrick had done a nice job of it. I know he went off to school in Canada somewhere, so he had done some travel. He'd been in other places. He came back to his hometown, to the school in his hometown, and he was a professor there for 30 years, and he was back in his home parish, surrounded by family and friends, and I think he did okay. I think Patrick probably drank a little too much, but I think he did a good job.
You said did okay. Well, what was he doing?
Living his life.
Right.
Living his life. He was content. He wasn't happy about everything. I know, because I used to talk to him. He wasn't happy about everything, but...
If he was happy, you guys could have been friends.
No, but he was cheerful and optimistic, and didn't ever see any need to go across the country to be uncheerful and pessimistic somewhere else.
Right.
I don't know. It was like a Wendell Berry story, except set in western suburbs of Chicago. You're just walking out, turning right, seeing the kids playing.
There you go. Nothing wrong with that. Everybody's got to be from somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Even New Yorkers.
Yeah. Bless them.
I remember that salsa commercial that they used to have about the competitor salsa. This salsa is made in New York City. New York City.
Charity and I ate at a little sandwich shop yesterday, and I went over to the little stand, where they got the salt and pepper. You can't have salt and pepper shakers anymore. Now it's all disposable little packages, because, we don't want everything to be a fomite, the disease vector. But they had this jar or little glass bottle of hot sauce, lid on it. And I'd never seen it before, and I grabbed it and I brought it over and I put some on my sandwich. And unlike myself, I told her it was pretty hot. Normally I'd say, oh, it's fine, and she'd burn down over it, because that's sport for me. But I put some on there and I ate it. I said, pretty good. And she said, well, where was it made? She wouldn't try it until she knew where it was from. Yeah.
Well, all right. Anyway, so back to the story. Thad goes home, and they're trying to calm him down, but he won't be. He actually... all right, so the story's hard. Okay, so I think it's the end of 58 and into 59, talking about the disease that had gotten to Thad. So he'd worked on this farm all his life. Through all his years of paying for it, he had aspired toward it as toward a promised land. To have it, he'd worked hard and long and deprived himself, and Rachel, his wife, had deprived herself. He had worked alone more often than not. Abner, the villain, as he grew able, had helped, as the girls had also. But Abner had been reserved for something better. Right there, that's the problem. Abner was smart, too smart, as Thad and Rachel agreed, without ever having much talked about it, to spend his life farming a hillside. Something would have to be done to start him on his way to something better, a promised land yet more distant. Although he had thought the farm not good enough for Abner, Thad was divided in his mind. For himself, he loved it. Divided in his mind. So right there, think about what's going on. Thad Coulter has his farm. I don't know what it looks like. Probably a decent farm.
Apparently there's a hillside.
Yeah, farming, which must be a pain to plow up and down a hill. But what do I know? I'm not a farmer. But if he has this idea that his kid needs something better, that's a reflexive statement. Think about what that says about what you have. I need to send my kid away to something better. Well,
isn't that the American dream, to want better for your children?
I suppose it is, but it's a Great Gatsby kind of a dream. It's that light at the end of Daisy's dock in Great Gatsby. It's this thing you can't ever get. We're going to read that one?
I hope not. I don't like that POS.
I used to read a fair amount of F. Scott Fitzgerald.
I don't know. Maybe I should read it again. I haven't read it this millennia for sure.
We'll put that on our infinity pile. I believe it's in the public domain now.
I'm comfortable putting anything on the infinity pile because we'll never get to it. It's fine.
But Thad's divided in his mind. So he loves his farm, but he doesn't love it enough to think it's good enough for his kid.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a dissatisfaction right in the core of Thad. I don't know how else he would have done that, but by they probably told him, you're too good for this. Well, he wasn't too good for that. He made a bad end trying to run a store when he might have been a good farmer.
Yeah, I was thinking about farming the other day, and talking to a friend of ours, Karl, and we were talking about supposedly that there's this sort of verbal IQ and a mathematical or spatial IQ. You know, there's these different aspects of intelligence and whatever. And I said, well, you know, how does that figure into, like, how do conventional measures of IQ figure into one's ability to properly determine when to move cattle onto a new paddock? It takes some mental horsepower to look at all of the factors involved. You know, am I going to run out of forage before winter is over? You know, what is the condition of the animals? What's the weather? I mean, there's just so much going on. You know, how does one figure out how to do that? So, you know, it's easy to look at the work of a statistician who works at an insurance company and figures up actuarial tables. It's very easy to put your finger on what kind of intellect and where the intellect lies in that kind of a job. But making the kinds of decisions that happen in small-scale farming like that, it's not clear what the heck is going on. And you really can't necessarily write it all down in a book. But it's probably way harder, and it's probably a more taxing intellectual exercise than figuring out how likely somebody is to get in a car wreck this year.
I don't know necessarily harder, certainly different. I went on a date once. This was a long time ago, obviously.
How'd it go?
How did it go?
Mm-hmm.
Poorly. I took her to the zoo.
Mm.
Okay. She wasn't stupid, I don't think.
Well, if she did stick with you, she is.
Well, not as smart as I had hoped she would be.
Right.
But not an idiot, college girl. She managed to graduate. But I took her to the zoo, and foolish me, I actually wanted to look at the stuff in the zoo. And I remember her walking through the primate exhibit, and she just would look at him and say, monkey. Look at the next one and say, monkey, 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 monkey. Well, they weren't all monkeys. There were some lemurs in there. and
the odd marsupial.
And I knew that it was over right then. You know, she didn't notice things. And I think there might be an intelligence vector for noticing stuff. And I think that would be what would make you good at agriculture or craftsmanship. We have a craft channel on our Slack right now. And I don't do much of that, but I LARP on there. I lurk. I'm not even LARPing. I'm just lurking, watching the rest of you build stuff. And you got to notice things that I, with all my book learning, might not. You know, you're making that wood into a table leg or something, and you have to, I don't know, notice the grain. I don't even know enough to talk about it intelligently. Mm-hmm. But things that you might, well, this is the way we're going to do it. Well, why are you going to do it that way? Because this is the way it needs to be done. Or how do you know that the cattle need to move? And if I ask you to put it in words, maybe you could. Maybe just it's time. Well, how do you know it's time? Well, because it's like your uncle talking about how you know the pecan tree, right? Pecan, however you say it. Pecan.
There you go.
You just sit out there and you look at it. Well, Abner wouldn't have been content, or at least the way he'd been raised as a little prince, probably destined for greater things, he wouldn't have been content. Which, you know, gets in another point. Why do you need to go to town and open a store? What will be better in your life having done so? And that gets you to the question of what's a human life? What's it for? That's why you need to read Aristotle, or at least the first chapter of Nicomachean Ethics.
Yeah.
What's the point of your life? What are you living for? And some clarity on that, and then you might realize, I don't necessarily need to do this thing. Maybe I can do something else and be content and happy.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with Abner operating a store. But in this story, there's no discussion about, even from a young age, he had set up a lemonade stand. He was very interested in that and had no talent for farming activity. I mean, there's nothing in there about, the particulars of Abner.
No, it's just the thing for the farm kid to do is he moves up in the world.
Yeah. My dad
moves up in the world right there. That's the problem that in this paragraph, which haunted both times I read it, the poor Thad, when he admits or decides that his son needs to move off the farm because there's other things that are better, that means that his farm isn't much.
My dad was a diesel mechanic, and he always told me that he wanted me to do not have to get dirty for a living.
Yeah. There's worse things.
There's worse things.
There's lots of ways to get dirty.
It worked out. Yes. And it worked out pretty well for my family. It's easy for me to say. He's the one getting dirty every day and getting his fingers mashed, being a diesel mechanic, so that we could do whatever we did.
Gosh, you work hard so that your kids can have opportunities. I get it. But you ought to have clarity on what's an opportunity and what's just a distraction. What's the point of your life? Is the point of your life to make a whole lot of money? You're still going to end up dead.
Right.
If the point of your life is family, then maybe some choices aren't so good. There's lots of rabbit holes I could go down right now. Thad is drunk and angry, and he pushes away his lovely daughter, and she falls. I don't know if she was lovely, but everyone loved her.
I like the depiction of her, though. When she rides up in the mules over at Ben's house, she says they were driven by Thad's daughter wearing a sunbonnet, a sun-bleached blue cotton dress, and an apron.
And then after he has done it, the tragedy of Thad Coulter. This is page 60. He had never spoken to her in such a way, had never imagined himself doing so. He hated what he had done, and he could not undo it. Is that true? Can he not undo it?
I have a friend who is from Okmulgee, Oklahoma, and he is a ginger and a recalcitrant redneck, maybe one of the smartest guys I've ever known. He's a plumber. And he and I were eating lunch one day, and we were talking about guilt and shame. And he said, well, let me tell you the difference. There ain't any soap that'll take shame off. And I said, okay, well, but what's the difference? And he said, my daddy was the town drunk, and every time I go on a plumbing call to one of these old timers that are my dad, I'm ashamed. And there's nothing I can do about that. He said, you can make up for guilt. You can go apologize, make amends, buy a new vase, and do whatever you need to do to put it back together. But there's nothing you can do about the shame. Thad's got both here. He's got a great deal of shame because of what his son has done. But what he did to Martha, he would have guilt about. He pushed her, and he probably could have done something about that. He could have apologized and done better, and by proved that was not of him, and so on.
So that might be part of the reason he sabotages the help he could have gotten from Ben.
I think so. This is the great deal of this is about shame. Luckily,
yeah, because he'd always would have been the guy that nearly lost his farm,
right? Even
if things went well.
Even if he worked doubly hard, they don't say this, but he's probably going to Ben to borrow money. I mean, how's Ben going to help him? Go to the bank and plead? Like, that's really the only way that Ben can help him, or perhaps buy it from the bankruptcy auction if the bank forecloses. It's about money, and Ben's going to have to bail him out there. And maybe he could work double hard and pay Ben back quickly, and that would be okay. His son is an F-up, and his son screwed his mom and his dad, and the universe knows. That's pretty rough.
Mm-hmm. So he doesn't see any way out. Well, he sees a way out, but it isn't a way out. He goes and he drinks some more. I don't want to read it. I've read it twice. I don't want to read it. Yeah. But he figures out what he's going to do. Takes the pistol down from the little shelf above the door frame. And his lady folks say, now, put that away. You ain't got a use in the world for that. Don't contrary me, Thad said. Don't you say another damned word. And his wife says, wait, Thad, eat a little before you go. But he won't do that either. And he's joyful. So he walked to the barn, steadying himself by every upright thing he came to, so that he proceeded by a series of handholds on door jambs and porch post and gate post and tree. He could no longer see the place, his farm, but walked in a shifting aisle of blinding light through a cloud of darkness. Behind him now was almost nothing, and ahead of him was the singular joy to which his heart now beat in answer. He's Achilles. His rage is pleasing him. At the end of he was not in his life now, and his rage pleased him. So he's just, and his rage is at Ben, and everything that's tied up in him, he's going to take it out on his friend with a pistol.
Yeah, I like these little details that are in Berry.
You can't read him very fast.
No, I don't want to either. It's like drinking that bourbon. He went into the white mule's stall, unbuckled hame strap and belly band, and shoved the harness off her back, letting it fall. He unbuckled the collar and let it fall. Again his rage swelled within him, seeming to tighten the skin of his throat, and though his body might fail to contain it, for he had never before in his life allowed a mule's harness to touch the ground if he could help it. Most of these characters in these Berry books have a pride in their work and of doing things the right way that just delights me to no end. You know, all that harness is made out of leather and wood, and you don't want it on the ground in the barn.
This is a story being told by Margaret. She's not there, but she's probably talked with all these ladies over the years, and he let that harness fall.
Yeah, it might fall in cow pie or
blood. But that would have been a detail of note.
Uncharacteristic of the man. Yeah, cow pie. I say cow pie.
I know what a cow pie is.
He said, here it is. More energy was generated in the community. This is about Port William. Than the work of the community could consume, and the surplus energy often went into fighting. There had been cuttings and shootings enough, but usually the fighting was more primitive, and the combatants simply threw whatever projectiles came to hand: corn cobs, snowballs, green walnuts, or rocks. In the previous winter, a young coulter by the name of Burley had claimed that he had an eye blackened by a frozen horse turned thrown as far as he could determine by power of the air. Somebody was mad at him and just hucked a horse apple at him. So funny.
Yeah, and power of the air is another biblical reference, Zoomers.
Yeah.
You could read that thing and help your understanding of literature. Read the thing twice. I don't want to read to the point that you get to, where he shows up in town, sees his friend, and I don't even want to read it. It's page 63.
So Ben is talking to some friends. He's talking to Dave Coulter, who's Burley's dad. Burley is Jaber's best friend.
Thad's brother, I guess.
Yeah. And he says, I'm sorry, Ben. Thad don't often drink, but when he does, he drinks like the Lord appointed him to get rid of it all. And somebody cried, look out. They turned to see Thad and the white mule almost abreast of them, and Thad was holding the pistol. They said he looked just awful, my grandmother said. He looked like death warmed over. Ben said, without raising his voice, in the same reasonable tone in which he had been speaking to Dave, hold on, Thad. And Thad fired. Dave saw a small round spot appear in the center of Ben's forehead. A perplexed look came to his face, as if he had been intending to say something more and forgot what it was. For a moment he remained standing just as he had been, one hand on the rim of the wagon box, and then he fell. As he went down, his shoulder struck the hub of the wagon wheel so that he fell onto his side, his hat rolling underneath the wagon.
You know, every time I watch West Side Story, I'm yelling at him. I'm screen talking. Don't do it. You can see the whole story is leading towards this moment, and of course you know it happened, and yet I'm still yelling at the characters. Don't do it. Ugh. And this is fiction, I know, but, you know, things like this happened. Well, probably today, but happened in my family history. Things like this. And in your family history, too, and in everybody who listens to us if you go back far enough.
Yeah. Charity's paternal grandparents live out in the boonies that way. They always call because they're worried about crime closer to town. But how much crime, particularly violent crime, is between strangers? Not very much. Almost everything you read about in the news is crime related to people who know each other. Almost all of it. Crimes of passion. Somebody cheated on somebody and somebody knows who it was, or cousins that, some deal goes wrong between them or some old resentment. And most of it is that. Strangers aren't as dangerous as as we think. Most murders happen between people who know each other. Seems to be. Some criminologist is going to tell me otherwise.
Yeah, it depends where you go. If you're a target for a robbery, that's not going to be because they knew you.
Right. That's true. But how many targets for robbery are the cleaning lady's son who knew you had something there at the house?
Well, that's not the kind of robbery I'm talking about. I'm talking about when they club you over the head and steal your stuff, or steal your car, or wait for you to get out of the ATM.
No, why do you think the cleaning lady's not going to son's not going to club you over the head? I mean, I still think that's true. Matt's in town. Matt hears it, sees that his father is dead.
I'm sorry. What I like about the way Wendell Berry writes is before you even get there. So Ben is now dead in the street, and Thad has put the pistol in his pocket, and he's kicked his mule again, and he's off to wherever he's going to go. Hargrove, I guess. But you get another page and a half of details of the way Ben Feltner lived his life. Of his farming plans, of the way he tried to get everything done for Sunday, because on Sunday they didn't want to do anything except milk and feed, which I guess if you're a farmer, you still have to milk and feed. You don't get Sundays off. But other than that, he's trying to finish everything up so he and his wife can go and visit people on Sunday in their buggy. And even more details about Elder Johnson, the blacksmith. So he's just taking his time. The man's dead in the street, and you're giving me more town history before we get to what happens. Well, yeah, that's the way Wendell Berry is. I think there's a point to that. I used to watch Arnold Schwarzenegger films. I enjoyed them, I confess. I can't really watch movies anymore, but I enjoyed them when I was younger. So in Commando, I think I counted once, something like, oh gosh, I think in Terminator, 75 people. I did the body count one time. Yeah. And none of them have any, maybe two of them have any backstory to them. You have no idea who they were. It doesn't hurt you. It doesn't hit you. In the Austin Powers movies, Austin Powers' dad, Michael Caine, is telling the minions, why don't you just go away? I'm going to kill you. You're a minion. You don't even have a name. He doesn't.
The red shirts on the Star Trek shows.
Yeah. But if you read my favorite book of all, which is the Iliad, at least that's my favorite book of all today, Wendell Berry is a bit Homeric in this, a little bit of a long-winded Homer. When Homer tells you that somebody died, he tells you in verse who he was, who his father was, what they used to do, where they lived. So the character shows up for nothing but to get clubbed by Achilles. Except that it's not a nothing character, because none of them are.
Yeah.
Even in real life, none of them are. They're all people with histories and pasts, and there's no rush. We'll get to the body in the street, but let me tell you about Elder Johnson, who remembers the name of a mule that came in years ago to get a shoe.
He said, you bet I remember him. That mule could kick the lard out of a biscuit. So Ben's dead, laying there on the ground. He tells a little bit about Ben, and he says he never believed in working on Sunday, and he did not believe in not working on work days. He's continued to develop that character that's laying there dead. And then he talks about the blacksmith, because town life is still going on. It's so good. It's such a good storyteller. Yeah, and they heard the single voice raised and warning out in the road, followed immediately by the shot and the rising murmur of the excited, indistinguishable voices as the whole Saturday crowd turned its attention to the one thing. Matt hurried out with the others and saw the crowd wedged in between the storefronts and Dave Coulter's wagon. He only began to realize that the occasion concerned him when the crowd began to make way for him as he approached. Let him through. They let him through. He sees. He checks his dad's pulse. It's gone. He says, who did this? The crowd answered, Thad Coulter. He'd done it. Where'd he go? And they tell him by the time Matt was free of the crowd, he was running.
Yeah, it's so good. There's that detail of the guy trying to get a part fixed in the blacksmith shop. And Elder Johnson doesn't have any time for him. Says, what do you think I am, a hammer with a brain? Just leave it somewhere. and maybe I'll get to it. It's just revealing to me the character. So the customer takes whatever part it was and leaves it conspicuously near the forge. And so you have this idea that Elder Johnson, he's going to be gruff and he's going to yell at them and say, I don't have time for this. Like, see all this work I got to do. But if you leave it there, he'll look at it later and darn it, and he'll do it. Just because you left it there, he'll fix it for you. There's a whole bunch of touches. My book and a half worth of Wendell Berry, it's a delight. All of these little details. If you like human beings, it seems that Wendell Berry does as well. And it's in the details, I guess. Details reveal character.
Yeah, Jack rides a particular horse into town. He talks about the horse, and he's at Peter Chatham's desk, and he says, sounds like they're getting Saturday started out there, Jack said. I reckon, Peter said, checking his figures. They're going to keep on until they shoot someone who doesn't deserve it.
So Matt's running down the street with murder, revenge on his mind. Jack's just about to sign a check. Jack, you'd better come. They shot Ben Feltner. Jack never signed the check that day or for several days. He ran to the door. When he was outside, he saw first the crowd and then Matt running toward him out of it. Without breaking his own stride, he caught Matt and held him. There's no thinking here. He just sees that this young man in a rage. Well, it says that Jack could hardly have known what he was doing. He had had no time to think. He may have been moved by an impulse simply to stop things until he could think. At any rate, as soon as Jack had taken hold of Matt, he understood that he had to hold him. And he knew that he had never taken hold of any such thing before. He had caught Matt in a sideways hug that clamped his arms to his sides. Jack's sole task was to keep Matt from freeing his arms. But Matt was little more than half Jack's age. He was in the prime of his strength. And now he twisted and strained with concentration of fury, uttering cries that could have been either grunts or sobs, forcing Jack both to hold him and to hold him up. They strove there a long time, heaving and staggering, and the dust rose up around them. Jack felt that his arms would pull apart at the joints. He ached afterward. Something went out of him that day, and he was not the same again. And what went out of Jack came into Matt, or so it seemed, for in that desperate embrace he became a stronger man than he had been. A strength came into him that held his grief and his anger as Jack had held him. And Jack knew of the coming of the strength not because it enabled Matt to break free, but because it enabled Jack to turn him loose. He stepped away, allowing himself to be recognized, and Matt stood still. To Jack, it was as though he had caught one man and let another go.
This is a wonderful Wendell Berry device. And what went out of Jack came into Matt. Or so it seemed, for in the desperate embrace, he had become a stronger man than he had been. There's a line in Jayber Crow after Aunt Cordy dies and he goes to the orphanage where he says something like, I'm doing this from memory, he went out of what he'd come out of love into charity and went then into charity without love. I can't remember what it was, but he has this juxtaposition where he reverses the order of the words in the sentences.
I believe this is called a chiasm.
Oh.
Chiasmus.
Karl knows all the words. Karl knows all the words.
Too many.
And he does it a couple times in this story, and I love it. He's able to describe a intangible emotional state by describing these two more tangible things. He talks about something went out of and came into. It's great. It's compelling to me. He does it all the time. Chiasm, whatever.
It's Homeric.
Right.
Gosh, it's a hard story. So there's another great deed when Jack, so I suppose the great deed might be Jack's.
Taking care of his nephew.
And I was thinking in the bathroom, well, why didn't he just kill Thad? What's the problem with him going down and getting revenge?
It's a good question. Is it revenge?
Justice.
Is it justice?
The group of concerned citizens that physically tore apart so that there was no body to bury the person who may have done terrible things to my great-great-aunt. Okay. Horrible story. What did that do to them?
I don't know, Socrates.
Well, that got me thinking the point of justice. What would they have done to Thad in 1912 if he'd gone to trial?
Hung him.
Yeah. But it would have been impersonal justice doing it, blind justice doing it, not the son of the of the guy that was murdered.
Which is better?
I think if blind justice does it.
Why is that?
Because it would have changed Matt Feltner's character to be the one to engage in the violence to kill Thad Coulter.
So in my Uncle Roy's story, someone did something awful to a lady in town, and the men of the town decided that that person needed to not be anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And they sort of drew straws, but they ended up picking the guy that had the least to lose from it in terms of, if somebody got convicted of being a vigilante of murder. And he killed the guy and ended up fleeing.
Not Uncle Roy.
Yeah, this was
ancestor.
Yeah. Well, I know the names, but in this Wendell Berry story, everyone knows Thad did it. This is not a mystery. There is no question as to who done it or any of that kind of thing. It's only the only questions are, now what? Right? And in my Uncle Roy's story, I assume, and I don't know this, but I assume, and he doesn't know this either, that everyone knew who did what. It just brings up questions of justice and retribution. What is the purpose of, if blind justice hangs Thad, to what end? So Thad doesn't do it again? Thad's not going to do it again. Thad's not going to do it again. To keep other Thads from doing it?
Well, okay.
Like, what are we doing?
Go back to Aeschylus.
Oh, I know.
Okay, so Clytemnestra has killed Agamemnon. He might have had it coming, but nevertheless, mom kills dad. Orestes comes and kills mom. Well, what are the consequences for him? Even though he's technically in the right, the Furies come after him because he's done this deed.
Right.
And he can't get clear of it. And eventually, well, some magic happens in the third play, and I guess he gets clear of it. But one would hate to have young Matt Feltner be afflicted by the Furies.
Right.
And furthermore, if he does it, then you've got a Coulter killing a Feltner and then a Feltner killing a Coulter. And what happens for the rest of time between those two families?
Oh, I know. I get it.
I'm inclined to say having impersonal justice is better than eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. Not because eye for an eye, tooth for tooth is necessarily incorrect. It's actually the biblical example of strict justice. But it'd be hard on that young man to go do it. Man, what would it have been done to Thad's daughter? I think we talked last week. That's that line from Elder Zosima and Brothers Karamazov. We're all responsible for everyone else's sins. Kinda.
Yeah.
Well, certainly in Port William you are.
For sure. If you're in a community, you are. Spoilers. In the interest of getting this done.
Do we ever get to the end of stories? I don't think we do.
No. Seminar is not meant to be exhaustive, Karl. Thad eventually turns himself in. Matt goes home. Jack goes home. Men of the town bring the body home and lay him in state there. And another group of townsmen come to the door, and Matt tells them to. They say, just say the word, and Matt tells them to stand down and invites them in for food. When somebody dies and it's done right, there's casserole. And Thad kills himself.
In the jail after his daughter sits with him for 2 days, I think.
Yeah.
Silently. Yeah, so he'd been super happy to do this deed. And I guess when he's watering his mule, that's when he realizes what he's done and that he can't ever take it back. For the first time in 3 days, Thad could hear the quiet and a bottomless sorrow opened in him, causing him suddenly to clutch his belly and groan aloud. That line, hear the quiet. Mm-hmm. It's amazing what you can figure out if you turn stuff off. And you can just, I don't hear the quiet. That's a Wendell Berryism. What the heck does he mean by that? I don't know, but when I have the radio going and when I'm on social media and I'm on, reading political chats and getting all worked up, and I'm not really thinking about what I have to do or what I've done, much of it's a big distraction and a temptation.
These Wendell Berry stories and books are so damn sad, Karl. Melancholy. Why do I want to read that?
Because you're sad and melancholy.
Let me read a little chunk here about his mother, Matt's mother, Ben's wife. It says, she was already wearing black. She had borne 4 children and raised 1. 2 of her children she had buried in the same week of diphtheria epidemic, of which she had nearly died herself, and after the 3rd child had died, she never wore colors again. It was not that she chose to be ostentatiously bereaved. She could not have chosen to be ostentatious about anything. She was, in fact, a woman possessed of a strong native cheerfulness, and yet she had accepted a certain darkness that she had lived in too intimately to deny. She's cheerful and wears the black.
Rejoice always, pray without ceasing.
Yeah. I am a melancholy person.
You don't say.
Yeah. But I also think that optimism is cowardice. And pessimism is base and mean too. Life is sad. Young people that I care about who tell me they're getting married.
Don't ever tell Scott that.
I always tell them, congratulations. And then later I tell them, you know what that means? That means one of you is going to bury the other, and you're going to bury all your parents together, if you're lucky. Hey, it's not live happily ever after. It's not.
Well, that's what live happily ever after means.
Well, you're right. I agree. Life is melancholy. There are a whole lot of funerals between when your mom squeezes you out and they throw dirt on you. And there's a lot of heartbreak, and there's a lot of very good too. And I think it's good to wear that black and have that native cheerfulness that she has. If you're going to try to write a realistic story that tells something real about humans, and if it does not contain melancholy in it, it's going to be fantasy or comedy or something else. And I'm going to say it again. Optimism is cowardice.
My former student who was at the funeral, she was probably the most sad there, but she was also angry. Okay, so she was angry. She thought if he had taken care of himself better, because he didn't really, that this wouldn't have happened.
Patrick was going to die.
He's going to die. It was probably going to be soon anyway. So her response was a little different than mine, and I was sad too, because I wasn't going to be able to talk to him again. But sure. I was thinking, he did all right, shorter than some, longer than lots. He did okay.
Sure. I went to a funeral once.
Just once?
At least once. And at one particular funeral I went to, it was for I think he was an 87-year-old man. And one of his daughters was saying, why?
He's 87.
And when we grieve, we say things and feel things, and it's not entirely rational, and I understand that. And he was close to me. I was sad, and I cried, but I know that he had had a good run. And there was no why in it for me. Optimism's cowardice. It happens. I think I told it on one of the podcasts about the 48-year-old acquaintance of mine that died of a massive heart attack the other day. Did I tell that on the podcast, or was that just you and I talking?
I don't remember. Where you said it.
Yeah, a girl I went to high school with was married, and she and her husband had dinner, and they had put their kids are grown. They're young adults, but they're grown, and they had put the dishes away, and they had sat down and were having a chat, and he stopped talking. And he was DRT. He was dead right there. He had a massive heart attack. And that's not very good. I mean, my friend from high school is going to have to deal with that, and she's a widow now, and she's very sad, and she's experienced a great loss. But boy, what a great way to go. You have a good dinner with your wife, and you sit down, and you're having a visit, and then you're dead. There's no screeching brakes. There's no forehead passing through the windshield. There's no chemotherapy. There's no gunplay. Sounds pretty good.
Well, the thing is, when you say optimism is cowardice, that optimism as in bad things will never happen.
Or that it's all going to be okay, because it is going to be okay, but not the way the typical optimist says, you know? Charity's grandpa Leroy used to tell me, don't worry about a thing. Nothing's going to be all right.
Yeah, so that's why I keep looking back at the verse that gives the title. The pray without ceasing refers to the grandmother. This is what she does. But I like the whole sentence here, which I think is better than optimism. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks in all circumstances. So your friend that died after dinner, well, it was going to happen at some point.
It was earlier than maybe he would have picked on his own.
But you rejoice anyway. I'm sorry to be pulling all this biblical stuff in here, but...
Man that is born of woman is a few days and full of trouble.
Yeah, or even Job. You know, the Lord gives, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And he's sitting on a dung heap, scraping at his sores with a potsherd. He's still pissed off, and he argues with God, but that's an interesting book.
Yeah, it is.
And God doesn't really give an answer. Just says, I have plans that you don't know of. Were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? Well, no, so shut up.
Hush.
And Job takes the answer, actually. You don't know what's going on. Life, all of life's a gift, but it all has an expiration date. And everybody you see has an expiration date. And if that changes your perception of life, it's probably not the correct one. Does that make sense?
I think so. I had a friend who was, again, 87. He died the other day. I think I told this story in the podcast. I do so many damn podcasts. I don't know what I've said, so I say things over and over again, but I don't care.
It's okay.
He died, and his oldest daughter, got control of his Facebook account somehow. I think he knew he was going to die, and they probably had let her know. Anyway, she said, my dad has died, and he died of COVID. When you die at 87, you're dead. If I died at 87, if my children listen to this...
that's unlikely.
Don't do an autopsy. I don't care, and you shouldn't care either. We're in the 9th decade. It's the bonus round. It doesn't matter. Iced tea can kill you when you're 87. We're not.
Iced tea the rapper or iced tea the drink?
Both. There's a point where it doesn't matter, and I think in Job we could make a point that it never matters. Because it's part of our lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the good people of Port William respond with rejoicing. I guess. I mean, they're sad, but they do all the rituals, and they don't hate each other. And
they knew a guy had a freak out. Can I read about the sheriff?
Sure.
So Thad goes into town to turn himself in, and he walks into the building. I've actually been in this building. I mean, it hasn't existed a long time, but I have memory of it. The place smelled of old paper and tobacco and of human beings washed and unwashed. When he could see again, he walked to a door under a sign that said sheriff and went in. It was a tall room lighted by 2 windows. There was a row of chairs for people to wait in and several spittoons placed at the presumed convenience of spitters that had been as much missed as hit. No one was there but a large man in a broad-brimmed straw hat and a suit somewhat too small who was standing behind a high desk writing something. At first he did not look up. When he finally did look up, he stared at Thad for some time as if not sufficiently convinced of what he saw. In a minute, he said, and he looked down again and finished what he was writing. There was a badge pinned lopsidedly to the pocket of his shirt, and he held an unlit cigar like another pen in his left hand. He said as he wrote, "You look like most of you's been worn off." "Yes," Thad said, "I've killed a man." The sheriff laid the pen on the blotter and looked up. "Who?" Thad said, "Ben Feltner, the best friend I ever had." His eyes suddenly brimmed with tears, but they did not fall. He made no sound, and he did not move. "You're a Coulter, ain't you, from up about Port William?" Thad said. The sheriff would have preferred that Thad had remained a fugitive. He did not want a self-confessed murder on his hands, especially not one fresh from a Saturday killing in Port William. He knew Ben Felter, knew he was liked, and feared there would be a commotion. Port William, as far as he was concerned, was nothing but trouble, almost beyond the law's reach and certainly beyond its convenience, a source, as far as he was concerned, of never foreseeable bad news. He did not know what would come next, but he thought that something would, and he did not approve of it. I wish to hell, he said, that everybody up there was going to kill each other would just, by God, go ahead and do it. I reckon you ought to go ahead and give me that pistol. Yeah.
Well, he's bored.
Yeah. I got arrested one time, and they handcuffed me to the park bench in front of the sheriff's office.
What'd you do?
I was being a teenager. Yeah. It really was. See, it was small town shit, so it really wasn't an arrest. They detained me and scared me. In Catoosa didn't have a holding tank or anything like that.
I've never been arrested. No, that's not true. I got picked up for jaywalking.
Oh, right. That sounds like that's very Chicago.
That was Milwaukee, New Year's Eve.
Picked up for jaywalking.
Nearly got picked up for underage drinking. Sorry, Mom. Yeah. We were sitting out in the field with a keg with a kid, a little bit young, well, a couple of grades down from me. This is college. Doing keg hits, and while we were doing it, the police pulled up, like as I was.
Yeah, so dumb.
And I said to the kid next to me, "So you ever been arrested?"
First time in?
Yeah, first time. We were very cooperative. I remember hearing over the radio, "Should I send the wagon?" Because we were playing softball with a beer keg. No, they're well behaved. We all just got to go home, but that was interesting.
I got to read some more of this prose. His writing is just, I've got wrinkles in my brain that fit his prose just right. And I don't know if anybody else likes it as much as I do, but in the latter part of the afternoon came Della Budge. So they're sitting at the house with the body, and people bring by food, and that's what they do, you know. Do they do that up there?
Sit by the body?
Well, and bring food and all that?
Yeah, but we don't do it in houses anymore.
Yeah, that's what we do around here. In the latter part of the afternoon came Della Budge. I love these names. Miss Della, bearing an iced cake on a stand like a lighted lamp. As she left the kitchen and started the front door, she laid her eyes on Jack. Anyway, they would make these cakes, you know, and then have it on the little glass stand, you know, it has a little cover. Bring it. She wore many clothes, for her blood was thin and she was easily chilled, and she carried a fan, for sometimes she got too warm. Her little dust cap struggled to stay on top of her head. A tiny pair of spectacles perched awry on her nose. She had a face like a shriveled apple, and the creases at the corners of her mouth were stained with snuff. Once she had been Jack's teacher. For years they had waged a contest in which she had endeavored to teach him the begats from Abraham to Jesus, and he had refused to learn them. He was one of her failures, but she maintained a proprietary interest in him nonetheless. She was the only one left alive who called him Jackie. She says, when your time comes, you must go by the hand of a man or by the stroke of God. Yes, ma'am, Jack said. He was standing with his hands behind him, leaning back against the door jamb. It'll come by surprise, she said. It's a time appointed, but we'll not be notified. Jack said he knew it. He did know it. So we must always be ready, she said. Pray without ceasing. Yes, ma'am. Well, God bless Ben Feltner. He was a good man. God rest his soul. Jack stepped ahead of her to help her out the door and down the porch steps. Did you ever know any ladies that dip snuff?
Yes. Yeah. Yep. My grandmother, yeah, apparently. Well, she had snuff boxes.
Yeah.
She didn't do it by the time that I knew her.
Yeah.
Is it more ladylike?
I don't know. My great-grandma did. She had quit about the time I came around, and if anybody brought it up, she got angry. Charity's great grandma on her maternal side dipped snuff. I guess it's probably they couldn't be bothered to carry around a knife and plug tobacco or twist tobacco or something. I don't know. I love the names in here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Della Budge.
That's where the title of the story comes from.
Well, should we wrap up this?
Yeah.
It would have been shorter if we just read the story.
Yeah.
It's a good one. It's worth your time. It's worth your time. It's better than Netflix. I like, this is page 75. It's a hard story to have to know, my grandmother said. The mercy of it was Martha Elizabeth, who went to stay with her dad without talking. If God loves the ones we can't, she said, then finally maybe we can. All these years I've thought of him sitting in those shadows with Martha Elizabeth standing beside him and his work-sore old hands over his face. Yeah, if God loves the ones we can't, then maybe finally we can.
What of Wendell Berry's spirituality? What can you learn about a guy from his fiction work? I'm not sure, right? I don't know. I don't think I said this in the Jaber Crow show, but Jaber was a religious obligate, I believe. He was devoted to an idea. He was a monk in the service of a love. He had a particular prayer life. He talked about the only thing that he could pray for was that God's will be done. We see these, and this pray without ceasing thing, we see these little glimpses of a Berry spirituality that, having been in towns like Port William and known a lot of these people, there's probably a lot of fire and brimstone, snake handling, Protestant, Calvinist stuff going on, but that's not what's in these stories.
No.
Man in Berry's stories is noble and redeemable and flawed in all of those things all at once. I mean, like literally all at once. Even Thad in his fury is noble and redeemable and awful in it all at once, even as he drops the hammer on Beltner. I'm really interested in that because, like I said, having been from little towns in the South and hung around with those people, that's a Berriansian kind of religion is not there. That's not what it is typically.
Well, there's an idea of Christianity sometimes that if only you do it right, everything will be better. And maybe on the local level it will. I personally don't think much of that.
Don't worry about a thing. Nothing's going to be all right. Nothing gets better.
Nothing's going to be all right. Okay, so in this book, Zoomers, there's a story at the beginning of this guy, Adam, and his wife, Eve, and they screw up. They do what they shouldn't have done. And
Zoomers, how dare you?
Well, they don't. I've had some of them as students, and one thing I noticed is casual biblical knowledge has gone to near zero. In 1999 or 1998, when I started teaching, that's a long time ago, students they'd know about Daniel and the lion's den, maybe. They'd know some of these stories, and nowadays people just don't know them. So I'm making a little fun, and maybe it's poetry, and maybe it's not true, and maybe you're not a Christian, that's fine. But it sure seems like humans, it says it in this story, humans do things that they're too smart to do. Somewhere earlier in this, one of the earlier stories.
The hurt man, yeah.
Well, that's a fact.
Yeah, how do you account for that?
Well, and whether you believe that it's because Eve took the apple, it doesn't say it's an apple, or for some other reason, humans do what they're too smart to do. And no amount of social engineering, at least so far, has been able to fix this. No amount of preaching fixes this on the general level. On the local level, it might help you. It certainly would. Get your stuff together, get your life together for sure. But human beings will be what they are. Now, if human beings can still be what they are, can you still love them? And you asked about Berry's spirituality, and I would think that's probably it.
Mm-hmm.
Can you love Thad Coulter? Mm-hmm. Well, if you know enough of the details, you probably can.
Martha showed us how to do that. That's Martha's job here. Her name's Martha.
Yeah, Martha is Lazarus's brother. Lazarus died.
Yeah.
And, well, I don't know. I don't know how intentional that is, but...
Well, we talked about Jaber's name and Jonah and all.
Barry'd probably hit us on the head if he knew what we were doing.
Yeah, but he knows what he's doing too. Come on. God knows what he's doing too. I think that in a sort of unchurched, secular society that we're in right now, Berry has a great deal to offer in this respect, because I think he has a healthy spirituality about him. And I think he is able to show us in these little stories, or even the long stories, how it works, the consequences of it, how you do it. I mean, it's zero dogma in it. It's wonderful in that respect. I'm not telling anybody that, to pick up the book of Berry and walk in his way, but I think it's wonderful and shows how healthy and good it can be. I thank him for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This Berry stuff is not what was being preached down at the church on the end of the street there in 1888 in Port William, I guarantee you. So, is the Port William membership superior to Faulkner's Yoknapatawpah County?
I have read 17 pages of Faulkner about 4 times, and that's all I can do.
We need to do it then. Yoknapatawpah. I could get it out.
Oh.
So Faulkner has this fictional Mississippi county that's supposedly based on the county that Oxford is the seat of. I can't remember what it's called. And he's got this family of the Snopeses there, and I think we should. I think it's far superior. There is not a nobility in the Faulkner characters like there is in the Berry character.
But if I have to read that, I'm going to make you read James Joyce.
No, listen, this is not the same. That's not the same. That's not fair.
You don't even know who's talking. It's the same kind of writing.
Well, there's some of that. That's true. Yeah, like, oh gosh, As I Lay Dying is a POS. It's terrible. Yeah, I've read that, but
well, have we beaten this to death?
No, but that's probably enough.
We've been running this for a while.
Yeah.
What are we going to read next?
I'm going to read this last page of this.
Okay, fine.
And then we'll talk about Asimov. Jack did not stay with them. As soon as he knew he was free, his thoughts went to other things. His horse had stood a long time, saddled, without water or feed. The evening chores were not yet done. Ruth would be wondering what had happened. His wife and his people at home don't have any idea. In the morning, they would come back together to be of use if they could. And there would be, for Jack as for the others, the long wearing of grief. But now he could stay no longer. As the porch was cleared, he retrieved his hat from the hall tree and walked quietly out across the yard under the maples in the descending night. So as not to be waylaid by talk, he walked rapidly in the middle of the road to where he had tied his horse. Lamps had now been lighted in the stores and the houses. As he approached, his horse nickered to him. "I know it," Jack said. As soon as the horse felt his rider's weight in the stirrup, he started. Soon the lights and noises of the town were behind them, and there were only a few stars, a low red streak in the west, and the horse's eager footfalls on the road. Life goes on in Port William,
Mm-hmm.
and for us. By the way, he says he walked out across the yard under the maples. It's the same house, I think, that Andy pulls up in his truck to get Grandma to tell him that story. Who's the hero? Jack's the hero, and Martha's the hero.
Yeah.
Jack is the community there at the right time to do the right thing, such as they can.
Yep.
And he does the right thing and doesn't even know why. And he says it explicitly in there that he doesn't even know why.
Good character.
And he does it maybe just to slow things down. Because you should slow things down until you know what the heck is going on.
Mm-hmm.
And that was Jack's impulse.
Yeah.
Can we pump the brakes a little bit out there, eyes? Can we slow things down until we know what's going on?
I was, okay, so we're way long in this podcast. That whole notion of, okay, so take it as an article of faith or take it as just a fact about human nature. If you know, I think the story of Adam and Eve frees you from a lot of things. If you realize that everybody is going to screw up, that everybody has screwed up, it can make you less judgmental. It can make you less quick to ban or mob people off their socials or whatever. If you don't have that idea, if you think humans are perfectible, okay? So if you don't buy into this Christian notion of original sin in some way, that means when people screw up, guess what? They're not really people. Because anybody that's really a person, that's really a human, would see things as you do. Because you, of course, are pure, and an original sin's a myth. Which means that anybody who falls short isn't really human, and you can do what you like with them.
Quit saying all them church words.
Can I say it in secular ways?
Yeah. Like, if you know that people do stuff that they know isn't best in spite of themselves, if you know that's true, and you believe that in your soul, you can cut them some slack.
Mm-hmm.
Original sin this, original sin that.
That's just what I said.
Well, I know, but except you said those church words.
I'm sorry.
Almost everybody hates those. And here's the consequence of not believing that. If folk can be perfect, then by God, they need perfecting right now. And I'm going to perfect the shit out of you.
Mm-hmm.
It leads to the utopian project. And I just don't buy it. You know, we're going to die. There's going to be suffering in the world. We're going to have heartbreak, disease, and all that other stuff. And it's wonderful in spite of it all. And it's all right.
Mm-hmm.
Don't worry about a thing. Nothing's going to be all right, Karl.
That's right. What are we reading next?
What was it?
Okay, so Isaac Asimov wrote a trilogy. He wrote more than that. Isaac Asimov is a mid-century science fiction author. Frustrating to me. And he wrote a series of detective novels where one of the detectives is a robot. And that's interesting. I picked the second one. The first one is Caves of Steel, but we're not going to do that one. The second one is The Naked Sun, which is set on a planet other than Earth. Well, where there's a society where there aren't very many people and they don't ever see anybody. And I thought that would be interesting.
Ruh-roh. Hey, guys.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
It'll be fun. Thank you for listening.
If you got to the end of this podcast, you get 10 bonus points.
You bet. You can go to onlinegreatbooks.com and join us. Maybe read a little of that Aeschylus that Karl was talking about. But, boy, read some Berry. He hasn't ever let me down. And, boy, it's sad as hell. Joyful, too. So difficult. What kind of a soul do you have to be both of those things in full measure simultaneously? He's one of my favorite things.
Mm-hmm.
The Hurt Man. Holy crap. You read that, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Let's do 2 more hours. The Hurt Man. The Hurt Man, 1888. Matt Feltner's 5 years old, and there's some guy running. And yet there's a commotion outside, and this guy's running, and his mom opens the door and ushers him inside, and he's been stabbed and cut up and just binds his wounds. And Matt never knew what he had done or who he was. But can you imagine that being a formative event in somebody's life?
Mm-hmm. Well, tell your friends. When's the enrollment open? Should be open by the time this podcast comes out.
That's right. We open Monday, and this will come out the Thursday after. So it'll be open for a few more days after you guys hear this show. And, go join us. It helps us keep the lights on. If we don't have members, listen, it's not the United Way. We're not doing this for charity. As long as people continue to go to onlinegreatbooks.com/podcast and signing up, then we know that this show is working because we have commercial interests. Then we'll keep on doing the show. Because when that stops happening, Karl and I will just have these conversations on the phone, and then I don't have to mince words anymore.
Yep, and go take a look at our other podcast, which we've been doing with Trent Jones, Music and Ideas. Lots of good stuff there. We'd like to spread that one around a bit and show you some beautiful stuff you might not have noticed.
Yeah, just did a Gershwin show. Got a funk show coming soon. I think that show's fun. Go listen to it. And we will talk to you guys in a coming Thursday. Bye.